Hello, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. In today's episode, we have another repetition, so to speak, of the topic, what is an API? It's a topic I really like to discuss because I think that an API is so many things to so many people. But in order to really understand what the value of APIs is, it's important to look at it from a variety of angles. And that is what we want to do today. We want to look at a fourth angle of what an API can be. We already looked at what an API is in 3 previous sections. The first one was very technical. It looked at what is an API and said it has to be networked and reusable. That is true on a technical level, but on the other hand, it's not that exciting, so to speak, and it's something that has been around for decades. So that perspective is important, I think, but it's not really all that surprising, or it's also not really where the true value lies. The second perspective on APIs was to look at APIs as products, or as I prefer to say, APIs as a way to interact with a product. In that scenario, what you say the API is mostly about is to provide the ability to consume a product or a service. So the API in that case is the way how people get access to a capability that exists. You may remember this example of beers, where my claim was that the value is actually in the beer, and the API is like a can or a bottle. It's a delivery mechanism that you really need to make the beer useful and valuable to people so that they can consume the beer. But in the end, the value itself is the beer. But it only makes sense to think about the API when you think of both things together, the delivery mechanism and the product itself. The third perspective we took was to look at an API as a language. We looked at that an API in the end is actually meant for developers, meaning that a developer consumes the API, so to speak. A developer understands the API, and then they write code that works against the API, and the value then is produced by that running code. But the important part really is that the developer needs to understand the API, and therefore you need to think about the developer so that they can understand the API, consume the API, write applications, and in the end deliver value to your end users. What we want to do today is to look at an API as a promise. What do I mean by this? An API is a promise because it is something where you say, if you want to get something done, here is how you can get it done, and that promise then hopefully has some stability so that people can build on it. It's really important to think of that if you develop APIs and you publish them, that people will start depending on them. And the important part there is to understand that the promise is made to developers who consume the API and write code, and then the promise is almost ingrained in that code, meaning that if you break the promise, you break a lot of code, and that's bad. And that's really important to understand, meaning that the more you actually care about the promise, the more you also care about existing applications, and the more you care about the ecosystem of those existing applications, and the more stable that ecosystem will be. And that is really important, in particular when it comes to scenarios where you have a lot of consumers consuming an API. You may think that breaking a promise is not such a big deal when you just made a promise to one party and you can negotiate with them and say, okay, now it's working differently and they can adapt. But when you break a promise that you made and that promise is affecting hundreds or thousands of consumers and breaking their applications, that's a totally different situation. And that's a situation you really have to keep in mind, because ideally that is something that you want your APIs to be used for. The value of APIs is in consumption. So you want to make consumption easy. You want to have many consumers, but that also means that you have to be responsible when you get to the point where you have many consumers. If you're not responsible and you say, oh, now I have many consumers, but I'm still breaking my promise, then that is going to be a problem, and you are going to have a lot of broken code out there and a lot of unhappy consumers, and that is not something that you want. Let's look at that promise in a little bit more detail. What does that promise entail? What are the important things about that promise? There are 4 things that are important about that promise. The first thing that is important is it's easy to understand and it works now. I can understand what you're promising me. I can give it a try. I can build something useful with it, and that may be good enough for me. So I'm happy, I'm building something, I'm producing value, and that alone already is important, that you made this promise, you documented it, I was able to use it and to build something with it, and that may be good enough as a first step. The second part of the promise is that it will keep working, and that is really important. This means that when you promise to me that I can get something done in a certain way, and I'm writing code, I'm writing applications that work with this promise built into these applications, I have to be able to trust you that this promise will keep working, that you will keep your promise. Otherwise, my applications will break, and that creates a lot of unhappiness, both for my users and for myself as somebody consuming your API. That's not a good thing. It's important to make a promise that you can keep. The third thing that is connected to the second one is you should be able to evolve your promise, to extend it, to make a more elaborate promise to others while still keeping your promise. That's the good old API evolution that we've discussed in other videos, saying that you should design APIs for extensibility, and that's really what this is all about. It means that if I use your API and you improve it, you still keep the promise that you made to me, but you can still improve it and, for example, make a more valuable promise to others who may be interested in those improvements. And if I'm interested in them, I can check them out, maybe I upgrade my applications, but I shouldn't be forced to do that. And that's an important thing to consider. And the fourth thing is that you should also make clear statements about how you will announce that you break your promise. At some point, you will have to retract your promise, and you will have to say, it used to work like this, but for whatever reason, we can't keep this going. And here's the plan how we will make that known to you so that you can adjust and that maybe you can switch to a better service, or maybe not. That depends on what you're doing. But the important thing is that you should be able to make that statement that you are going to break your promise without already breaking it. That's the topic of API deprecation and sunsetting that we've also discussed already, where the idea is that if you are responsible at managing the promises that you made, you always had a plan how you will prepare people once you are planning to break your promises, so that they can prepare and that you can reduce the unhappiness that results from this as much as possible. And once again, let's think about who this promise is for, because it's important to think about who you are making promises to, because that is also an important part of thinking how you design the promise, how you shape it, how you think you can create value by creating those promises. And let's move from the bottom up. And again, there are 4 levels we can look at. The very lowest layer, so to speak, is that an API is a promise between machines. 2 machines using a protocol, whatever you would like to call it, a way to communicate. And as long as both machines are properly using that agreement, things will work. That's fine, but the machines never really agreed on the promise or understood the promise. They're just programmed to use the promise. And that's a very different thing, and that already gets us to the next level. The second level where you can look at the promise is that the promise is for developers. It's a promise you make to a developer where you say, if you want to use a certain capability, if you want to use a certain service, here is how you can use it. Here is how you can program a machine that uses it. And as long as that machine is doing its job correctly, it will be able to interact with the API and everything will be fine. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because once a developer buys into that promise and writes code that depends on that promise, now you have something out there that is fairly stupid. Computers are pretty stupid and will blindly trust this promise. As soon as the promise is not valid anymore, that thing will fail. And that's expensive and disappointing and creates friction. So that's something that you want to avoid. So it's really important to think about the fact that the promise at the developer level is something that gets coded into the lowest level, and that level is expensive to change. So it's important to think about the promises you make to developers will be ingrained in expensive stuff that is expensive to change. So try to avoid the necessity for that by making your promise stable, long-lasting, and extensible. But in the end, of course, the question is, why do we even have an API? And that takes us one level further beyond the developer who is developing code against the API. And now we can go one level up to the third level, which is the product designer, the experience designer. In that case, the promise is that you say, I create a certain value. In the language video, we looked at the example of a weather service API. In that case, the promise that you make is you say, if you want to build experiences where seeing the weather is useful, for example, you want to build a weather forecast widget into your car or into your smart home, or you want to put it on your mobile phone, you tell them, if you want to do that, you don't have to design your own weather forecast service. We have a good weather forecast service, and here is what you can do with it. So this promise really is more for people who are designing those experiences. Let's say they design the car, they design the smart home interface, they design applications for mobile phones. They may not really be fully aware of all the technical details of APIs, but for them it's important to understand that, okay, I can get a weather forecast from this service. The weather forecast is available in multiple languages. It's available for cities all over the planet. It is available, let's say, for a 3-day or a 7-day horizon, and they can count on it. And that allows them to build experiences that then will be developed by developers who look at the details of the API and actually implement those applications that go in the car or go in the smart home. But it's also important that those product designers or experience designers really understand the value that you're providing, because they are the ones who will initiate the actual usage of your capability. The developers then have to execute on it. But initially, the drive will be from people who say, oh, I need a weather service. Where can I find one? And what does it allow me to do? So they're really important. So it's also important to think about what kind of promise you make to those designers, because only when they understand what you're doing, they might decide to use your service, and then you have your users of your APIs, which probably is good for you. And now let's look at the highest level of consumers of your promise. And that highest levels are the users, the end users. So the end users are actually the ones who in the end consume, let's stay with that example, who consume your weather service API. They will be the ones who are happy when you have a good forecast service. They will be the ones who are unhappy if your forecast maybe is bad. But most importantly, if we just look at the API level, they are the ones who depend on your API being available, being responsive, and being stable over time so that their car keeps working, that their home keeps working, that their mobile phone app keeps working. Now, if we look at this whole layer cake of individual parties that you made promises to, the machines, the developers, the designers of products and experiences, and the actual consumers of products and experiences, you make all of them unhappy when you break your promise. And it's really important to always keep that in mind, because you don't want to make them unhappy. Making an API successful means to create many consumers, and it also means to keep those consumers happy. And the best way to do that is to make good promises, to be able to evolve those promises, and to keep the promises for as long as you possibly can. Let's wrap it up. In this video, I wanted to present yet another perspective on APIs, and I wanted to present the perspective of an API as a promise. I think it's really important to keep in mind that an API is not something technical at its very heart. At its very heart is more a communication mechanism within an organization or across organizations. There is something technical to it at its core, and it's important to get the technical parts right. But if you only focus on the technical bits, you miss a lot of how APIs create value, how they create ecosystems of value producers and value consumers, value chains. And you also miss a lot of the perspective where it is important to think about, what am I doing with the API, not just on the technical level, but what is this ecosystem of producers and consumers that I'm building, that I'm enabling, and what do I have to do so that this ecosystem thrives, is stable, produces as little friction and unhappiness as possible, and produces as much value as possible. And for this to happen, I think it's really important to be a little bit more expansive in thinking about APIs and to move away from the purely technical perspective. And that's what I'm trying to do in this mini series of what is an API. And the idea of an API as a promise, I think, is a good way of conceptualizing what an API really does, without ever getting to the details of how exactly do I design it, what are the protocols, and all these technical details. That is important. I'm a firm believer that getting APIs right is important, but I also think that getting all of the context right, how this API is conceived, designed, managed over time, and so forth, it's equally important. And that's the reason why I produce these videos. So it was a lot of fun. I hope you liked it as well. If you did, please like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and if you think there's something to be said about this, please leave a comment. I'm always interested in feedback and opinions. See you next time. Bye.